This week on Quadriga, US-Arab war on IS, an uneasy alliance. As the US expands its air offensive against Islamic State to include targets in Syria, a group of Arab states have pledged their support. But can Washington rely on partners, some of whom are as eager to see the end of Syria's President Assad as they are to fight IS? Turkey, too, is wary of taking action that could strengthen either Assad or Kurdish separatists, but faces a growing refugee crisis. Given the fault lines in this coalition, is this really the beginning of the end for Islamic State? Your host this week, Brent Goff.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Quadriga. I'm Brent Goff, sitting in for Melinda Crane this week. If you've been following the speeches at the General Assembly of the United Nations this week, no doubt you've got the impression that there is global consensus about fighting Islamic State. On Wednesday, the UN Security Council passed unanimously a resolution to stop the flow of money and militia to the Islamic State. At the same time, airstrikes in Syria have begun, led by the U.S. without the U.S.'s traditional Western allies, but this time hand in hand with Arab states. An uneasy alliance, some are saying. Can it be a winning team? Well, we want to talk about that today. I'm joined here in the studio by Günter Seufert. He is a leading Turkey analyst with the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Before he came to Berlin, he worked as a journalist based in Istanbul. Günter, good to have you on the show. My next guest is Zafer Şenocakis. He is a writer and commentator on Islam and Turkish identity. His byline is known here in Germany. He's also taught on both coasts of the United States. Zafer, good to have you on the show. And to my immediate left is Martina Sabra. She's a journalist who has spent the last 20 years reporting from the Middle East. She has written extensively on migration and human rights. Welcome to you all. The world is talking right now about the speeches at the General Assembly, particularly U.S. President Obama's speech to the General Assembly on Wednesday, naming and shaming pushers of hate in the Middle East. That was part of his speech. He called on the Muslim world to purge itself of extremism and violence. And he said the fight against IS is not his, but everyone's on the planet. What did you make of it?
Well, I think in the first place, he's absolutely right in saying that. In the second place, one has to say that I think this is a nightmare for Obama. This is the worst case scenario which has become reality, which has become true. And it is, in a way, also a message of despair, because it is not at all clear how these airstrikes will be accepted, whether they will be accepted at all by the populations of the countries at stake of this alliance, which President Obama is trying to hammer together. Some of the regimes in questions like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, are supposed to have financed IS or the components that made up IS recently. And it is not at all clear, since they are Sunni, and this war in Syria and Iraq is more and more confessionalist, whether this will be accepted by the populations. This might create further conflict and much more tension, which might become a problem for the stability of these regimes, the neighboring regimes.
Let me ask, Günter, what was your take on what was said at the UN?
For me, it was not really a surprise what Obama said. For me, it was a great surprise, the U-turn in the political discussion of the Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan, who ruled out any possibility of a military intervention and also was very reluctant to give political support to the airstrikes or to the campaign of Obama. And now he came in with a completely different tongue, and therefore I think when I continue what you said, I think in Turkey it was in a way expected, and among the population, this turnaround, and I think the Turkish population is not really in opposition to this turnaround. Yeah. And therefore, the situation is very different even if Turkey is a Sunni country in Turkey and the Arab states.
Yeah, we're going to pick up on the Turkey issue in just a moment. Zafer, what did you make of what was said at the UN
Nothing new. I mean, we once again ended up in a military action in the Middle East. And I don't know if this is really needed in this region, because we have only wars in this region since 100 years. And this is a geography of pain for the people living there, with no hope, no future. And I couldn't see in Obama's speech any sign of changement for the region. I don't think that this is possible with these regimes existing there. So this is a kind of showdown that we see, and it's a terrible situation. Of course, these terrorists should be stopped. There's no discussion about that.
What do you think should have come?
What's afterwards?
Right.
What's coming afterwards? I don't see any sign of changement in this region. It's the same with the Iraq War. It's the same with what was going on in Syria since 3 years, with hundreds of thousands of dead people, with refugees around the neighboring countries, millions of people without home, without hope. And we need very urgent, a real new strategy between the cultures, between West and East. And I think Turkey has to play a bigger role in this, but it's not very clear what this government is planning really to do.
All right, let's pick up on what is going on, what's coming from Ankara right now. We know that there are, 1.5 million refugees right now in Turkey from Syria. We want to talk about what Syria is doing to deal with that, but also, as you just heard, what Syria may be planning to help solve the broader problem there in the Middle East.
Turkey is no friend to Syria's President Assad, and weapons and fighters have found their way through Turkey to those fighting against him. At the same time, Ankara has been nervous that Kurdish militants could emerge strengthened from this conflict and pose a new threat to Turkey. Every day, thousands of refugees cross from Syria into Turkey, seeking safety from the advance of Islamic State. Well over 100,000 have arrived in recent days, adding to around 1.5 million other people who have fled the war in Syria. According to the UN, the pressure is set to grow. It expects at least 250,000 more refugees to seek shelter in Turkey from the Islamist terror.
I mean, definitely a huge humanitarian crisis coming over the border from Syria into Turkey. Martina, what grade would you give Turkey right now for dealing with this 1.5 million refugees?
Well, for dealing with the refugee crisis, I think I would give them good grades, because Turkey is now hosting more than 1 million refugees, 1.5 million approximately, and the numbers are growing every day. So I think Turkey is really taking up some of the burden of this whole crisis. At the same time, Turkey's strategy has not been very clear and even contradictory. Some years ago, Turkey's government, Erdogan, was still side by side with al-Assad. After that, they hosted the coalition. They are still hosting the opposition, the Syrian opposition, and the leadership of the rebels. The rebels were trained, commanders were trained in Turkey. But these rebels, this Free Syrian Army and its components, they are now fighting against two enemies. And one of them is IS, Islamic State, and several other Al-Qaeda affiliated militia. And Turkey is indirectly or directly supporting these groups.
Your question...
So for me, the strategy is not very clear.
Günter, whose side is Turkey on right now?
I think Turkey, what I said before, is now shifting sides in a way. And I think what is even more important, that in Turkey there is a big confusion about the policy it will carry on in the future. Because what I see is that the foreign policy vision of the AKP government is completely unsuccessful. The Turkish government, and you mentioned it, tried to establish good relations with Assad, and he did it because the government did this because this closeness or this integration of Syria economically, politically, to bound Syria politically and economically to Ankara was the the central step in a vision of making Turkey a leading country in the Middle East. And therefore it had to integrate Arab populations and Arab states, and these small states in the Levant, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, had been considered as the apt options. And what we see as after Turkey was not able to convince Assad to approach the protests in a more peaceful way, it immediately shifted its policy in a very extreme way, in the way you said it. And this was true, or this was the reason for this, was not really concern about the developments in Syria, but it was the wish to carry on the old policy, namely to bind Syria to Turkey with other means in a different situation. And therefore it had to protect, or it had to support, these Sunni rebels. But we should not forget that at that time it was the policy of the Western world too. And Turkey only to its own
But Günter, I mean, the policy of the Western world was never to support IS, and Turkey was doing that by keeping its borders open to IS. And
that's right, but it was the policy of the Western world to support the so-called moderate Sunni population. And we saw, and Turkey later than the US and later than other Western countries realized in which direction the development is going.
What do you think?
But do we really understand the situation? I think Turkey is searching for its own side, in fact.
What is its side?
This nobody knows really, because the range is very broad. You know, this is on the one side, the Turkish government is like a prolonged arm of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East. That's very clear. On the other side, this government made already a lot of steps to be member of European Union, and both perspectives are somehow together. And maybe we should really think these perspectives together to make some progress in the Middle East. And we are not able in the Western world to think these things together, because we are already in this shifting situation between the cultural war between Islam and the Western world. The values of are so different and so violently.
You're saying Europe should change. Now, what you're saying is
Turkey already changed. Turkey already changed, but in Europe, why Turkey changed? Turkey changed not only because of this government. Turkey discovered its own population. Turkey was ruled over decades, like a lot of Arab countries are ruled by a kind of bureaucratic elite, can be a dictatorship somehow with some kind of votes and some kind of polls and so on, but it was not based really on the population, on the will of the population. And I think Turkey has discovered this now very, very strongly. And it's the question is, can Islamic societies establish a model, life model, which is in peace with modernity? This is the big challenge.
And Turkey has been considered the role model for that up until Erdogan's policies.
But where are the allies of Turkey in this way?
Well, it's a member of NATO. It's an ally of the EU, the United States.
But look, on this way to transform the Middle East to a more peaceful place, where trade is possible, where the future of the life of the people will be somehow improved, where conditions for education, for medical service are improved. For all those things, who is ally on the side of Turkey? I don't see any ally besides military actions. Military actions, yes. Turkey is a NATO member. Now we expect that Turkey maybe send boots on the ground in this conflict, but we don't see really a project, a perspective for this part of the world coming from the West.
What do you say to that, Martina? Is he being too easy on Erdogan?
Well, I think so, yes, because I think there is really a lack in strategy, and there are also, I mean, the interior politics, the inner politics of Turkey also play a role, because there are a lot of contradictions in interests, conflicting interests, etc. But I think we have to see this also within a wider range, and we have to see the regional players. We have to see that this is a proxy war. What is going on now in Iraq and in Syria is a proxy war. So the US and the West have to define their interests in this, because Russia is involved, Iran is involved, and if it is impossible for people on the ground now, in my opinion, to sort things out. And also the situation has become such a mess that there is no alternative at the moment. And this is the big problem. This is the tragedy in this development, in my opinion, that it has become such a mess that there is really hardly an alternative now to airstrikes against IS and also troops on the ground against IS. It is the situation has become so bad. I think there were points of return before, but these points of return have been missed, and I think it is difficult now only to deal with this in terms of cultural politics or political culture of sitting down and sorting things out for the people in the region alone.
Well, what about I mean, I want to stick with Turkey for just a couple of more minutes. What about this notion of Turkey being divided? I mean, Turkey has been in the process of coming, settling and finding peace with the PKK, correct? So you've got that Turkey to deal with, but you also have a Turkey that kept its borders open to IS militia. I guess the world is like, and then you've got a Turkey which has been very reluctant to sign off on the communique that was signed in Paris, the international campaign to defeat IS. So
Turkey is divided, that's right. And I say also it's not clear in which direction this government is leading this country. But one thing is very clear. There is a will of negotiation. There is a will of diplomatic solutions. This is very important. Yeah. And there is a reluctance against military actions. This is also very important. What we need in the region is that we can start real talks about a peace process. And this means not only the war between Israel and Palestine. It means a broader perspective of peace process where people can live with values, with common values, which can bind together the Western world and the Islamic world.
Well, I mean,
this is a big project,
And you didn't hear that. You didn't hear that in Obama's speech.
No,
I mean, he appealed to the golden rule, which he said is found in all the great religions.
He gives the burden only to one side.
Okay.
And this is not correct. We have to take the burden from both sides.
Okay.
Then we can find a peaceful solution.
Let me pull Günter, do you think Turkey is the weak link in this alliance now with the U.S. and the Middle East in fighting IS?
No, it's not so weak link, because it has very large potentials, very big potentials, and therefore I think it's a great power. It's not a weak link. Maybe it's not has not joined the coalition as it was expected until now, but I think it is shifting. But what I wanted to say to what Zafer said, I think, Zafer, you are perfectly right, but in a particular way. All the states in the Middle East are not built on consensus. And therefore, different parts of society have different visions of how the state should develop, which kind of society they would like to live in, but also who the nation is really, who is the core of the nation, the Sunni Muslim population or a more secular part of society. But what we see in Turkey in a very mild form, because we don't have civil war in Turkey despite the Kurds, we see in a much more extreme way in all the Arab states or in all the states of the Middle East that there is no really convincing founding narrative of the state, and most of the rulers are not legitimate by democratic consent of the people.
Which is what Zafer was saying here, right? Modernity.
And that's it. But I think it's in a way naturally Obama pointed to that point, and there he was right. But where I think is the contradictory, that when it comes to the policy towards Iraq, towards Saddam, there was no consideration of the state of society, of the state of societal discussion, political discussions in Muslim countries. But a state was destroyed because it not fitted our visions or our criteria of democracy. And therefore we see a shifting of the context, and that is to be criticized. That in the beginning of Obama's or of the US states Middle East policy when it comes to Iraq, there was a completely different context and completely different strategies for legitimation of the own policy. And this can be criticized, but this does not mean that personally I would not support now what is going on, the airstrikes, because I think it makes a big difference if you are destroying a running state, even if it is very suppressive, like in Iraq or in Syria, or if you are really preventing genocide. And that is what's happened in Iraq and Syria today.
What is the answer then? I mean, there are people who are against these airstrikes. What is the answer then when you have this tsunami of refugees and the people who can't get out of Syria are afraid that their heads are going to be cut off? So people
should be protected at this moment. This is not a question at all.
But how?
I mean, we have to do everything. I'm also for the airstrikes. I'm not against the airstrikes. But this is not the only question. I try to explain that we need a strategy for afterwards. You know, I mean, the war in Afghanistan after 9/11 was a right war to do. But what was the strategy after the war? I mean, we are staying in a situation where the conflicts are more and more growing, yes. And this is not. It cannot be our interest.
All right. Well, let's stay though with the immediate situation and with this, U.S.-led alliance, which includes Arab states. I mean, this is dramatically different from what we saw in 2003, because you've had John Kerry going around trying to get that support from other states in the Middle East. What's your take on that? The right approach, and is it the approach that's going to work to destroy IS?
I think this approach is the only approach. I mean, they all have to work together, but also we have to come to a situation where these states in question, these regimes at stake, where they become more clear also in their approach towards IS. It is impossible to have certain individuals, I mean, like powerful individuals and businessmen from these same states who are still supporting IS. And it is very difficult and almost impossible to get figures, like clear figures about who is supporting whom. But this is well known. It's not the states maybe themselves, like Saudi Arabia officially, which has been supporting IS, but very powerful individuals who are somehow linked to these regimes. So I think this has to become more clear. On the other hand, I'm not so sure whether this is so new, because there was tacit support even also in the past from these countries who are now involved in this coming coalition, in this emerging coalition.
Do you think it's important, though, of how it's being presented, that this is an international effort and that this is not an American action? This is something that the whole world wants.
Of course. In the ideal case, this should be UN-backed. This should be backed by a UN resolution, which seems impossible. But I think the more internationalized, yes, the better. Still, there needs to be a strategy in the long term. I think it is very difficult now to hammer out alternatives to what's going on, and there needs to be protection at the same time. But also there needs to be a very strong political process. There needs to be a political process to include the Sunni tribes, for example, who are supporting IS, because IS is not only about terrorists. IS has a broad basis of frustrated ex-Ba'ath officers, etc. So you need a very strong political process, and I doubt that this is in the making.
The whole Wahhabi ideology, which is on the stage since 20, 30 years, very much internationally, is at the task. And I hope that it will weaken this ideology, because it's the big barrier between the modern world, between human rights, democracy, progress in this region, and Islam. This is the big barrier. And of course, the Wahhabi ideology is our ally. This is our problem. It's a big problem.
Whose problem?
Problem of the Western world.
That ideology is our ally.
This is our ally. It was our ally against Iran, against the... now Iran is gaining a lot of ground this moment. It was our ally against communism in the Cold War. And this is what I mean, that we need a kind of real consensus on values. Without this consensus, we will have no step forward.
But where is, I'm intrigued by this, where is this consensus not? I mean, the Charter on Human Rights, the world agrees on.
Yeah.
So who's fighting against that?
Everyone. Everyone in the sense. Everyone.
Is that true? Gunther, is Germany fighting against human rights?
I would not like to answer
but I don't want to. But I don't want to let
Germany.
Yeah?
It's about the partners in the region.
No, I think there are two. We should differentiate between two different times, or between two. First, I think Obama is in a deadlock because what he's doing, he is criticizing the Muslim world and the Middle East for sectarian policies that divides the country, both in the region and the single countries. And what he's doing, he is forming a coalition of Sunnis fighting, for example, and he's not integrating. He has not tried to integrate other powers. That means he has not integrated Iran. He has not integrated the Assad regime.
But what about the British Prime Minister meeting with Rouhani?
Wait a minute. That means in a way he is criticizing a particular situation, and he is in the same way acting in the same context. And that is very dangerous. I think he had to do this because it was not possible to enlist the support of the Arab states when he would have not discarded Iran. But this again is a deadlock. And the other question is what Zafer said: how to deal with an ideology we had been cooperated with for a long time, but we now see is turning against the West, and an ideology that is able to link itself to very different localities, to very different social structures. What we see now that we have a German man captured in the Philippines. Yesterday, a Frenchman was killed in Algeria. You know what? We have a global discourse that is able to link itself to very different local political conflicts. And the discourse unites it, at least on the ideological level, against the West. And we have no strategy for dealing with that. I think these are different things, or at different levels, but we have to think it over.
Well, I think it's interesting what you're saying, because you're putting the blame at the doorstep of the Western world. Right? If we're talking about ideology, and so my question is, what's the strategy for fixing it?
I would not say to put the blame up, but I think we have to remember our past. We have to remember our colonial history that shaped the minds of the Muslims. And I don't see, and therefore I agree with Zafer, really no policy that is in any way taking this into consideration.
In the 19th century, end of 19th century, there was a kind of hope in the region. Although there was a colonialism and everything what we know, but there is a hope that through values like human rights, and there would be improvement of societies. And this was transformed by philosophers, by thinkers, and this is of course an inner Islam problem. This is not a problem of Mr. Obama and the West and so on, and there is nothing to talk about it. The xenophobic and anti-human roots in the Islamic tradition should be much more on the stage. And we should discuss much more on these issues. Also Mr. Erdogan, everyone who comes from this tradition has to discuss. But to push these guys to discuss, we have to stand to our values. It's very important.
So you're saying we have to live as an example, is what you're saying.
Much more.
And you're saying the West has not basically done what it's preached.
Exactly.
Is that?
I mean, this is a very it's a little naive position there, because mostly powers act after their interests. What I want to say is that it's our interest to show others our values. It's our interest. It's not because we are good people and so on. We should, in the end, understand that this situation in the Middle East cannot go on like this. We have to change things there, and we have to name every violation of human rights uninteresting from which side it comes.
Yeah, I think everyone would agree with you on that. Yeah.
This is a moral position, of course, but I mean, politics is not always about morals. I think politics is about interest. This is, of course, it's an interest, but I think another very important interest is not to side unilaterally ad infinitum with the Sunni forces, and this has happened. The West has fallen into this trap. I mean, the main antagonism in the Middle East today is between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and everything turns around this. And the West has for a very long time been sort of one-eyed. I mean, has had an approach where Saudi Arabia was the only ally and Iran was the arch enemy. Well, and I think this has to be redefined in a way.
Is it not? I mean, images are powerful. What about the pictures of British Prime Minister Cameron meeting with Rouhani this week in New York? The first time since 1979.
Might be a start. We have to see. We're still, I think it's too early to judge. It also, I mean, Iran is now very powerful. They have a lot of cards in their hands. They are powerful in Lebanon. They are dominating the political and militarily in Lebanon. They are the strongest supporters in Syria of the Assad regime. They were dominating to a large extent also the Iraqi regime. It's Iranian commanders who are called the shadow commanders in Baghdad and also in Damascus. So it is now. Iran has become very powerful, and they will also dictate, to a certain extent, the conditions. So I think it's too early to judge now, but I think still it would be a good sign if the West tries to overcome this one-sided approach, which it has been pursuing, in my opinion, for too long.
But I do want to ask if you get the sense, as journalists, that there is some type of dawning in a new approach. I mean, we know that U.S. President Obama, he has had a phone conversation with Rouhani. We had this week with Cameron. I mean, is that not a sign that this ice age is thawing a little bit? Or is it just window dressing?
Hopefully, it's only one page. There are a lot of pages. I remember when President Clinton visited Palestine end of 90s, there was such a hope in this region, and there was such a atmosphere of welcome, such a expectance. There was not a hostile position against the West and against the Western world in general. We lost this ground. Why we lost this ground? Maybe we should ask this question: why we lost the ground in the hearts of the people? We lost it, and this is the real danger. It's not the ISIS. The real danger is that we lost the ground in the heart of the people.
Of course, the conflict also, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict also plays a big role in this. I think. I mean, there was hardly any Near East policy under Obama. There was no progress at all for the Palestinians.
Not at all.
I mean, this administration was completely lenient when it came to land expropriation and to occupation. So this also plays a role, although I think it is a minor conflict in a way in terms of figures and numbers, but it is important politically and morally for people, very important.
Is there consensus here among all three of you that the Palestinian-Israeli problem there has to be a concrete solution before the broader Middle East is going to find peace?
Definitely.
I mean, a lot of commentators have been saying the two are not connected, but does everyone here agree that the connection there can't be denied?
Of course.
I think there are two levels. One is the level of instrumentalization of the Palestinian question by these forces, by these Sunni Muslim forces, but also by Iran. And the other thing is that there is really a problem. But I think we cannot close the eyes from the fact that these forces very successfully, for decades, instrumentalized the Palestinian question, and therefore we have to take it into account.
A lot of people have been asking in the media, imagine tomorrow there is an Israel, there is a Palestine, there is peace. Does that mean that the Sunnis and the Shias all over the world will also start loving each other?
We need a Bosnian solution. This is not a perfect thing. You look to Bosnia. Is this perfect? No. But are people dying there on the street? No. This is the solution. We need a Bosnian solution. We need military actions. We need a real interaction in Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We need it since 20 years, since not 20 years, since Rabin was killed in Israel, very clear. Yep. Since this process was interrupted. And we cannot allow that one roadmap is burning after another.
It sounds like you're hoping for another Jimmy Carter, another era like that.
Jimmy Carter was too weak. Okay. I wait for a very strong American president. Okay. I hope that he will come.
Let me bring it back to Europe for a second. The traditional allies of the United States are noticeably not in this airstrike alliance. Germany's not in it. The UK so far is not in it. When we're talking about Syria, what does that say to the world, and does it make this alliance, this U.S.-Arab alliance, does it make it weaker? Günter, what do you think?
It makes it definitely weaker in military terms. I don't know if it makes it weaker in diplomatic terms. And maybe there is also some good sign in it, that it is not the West as such who is bombing Syria or is bombing the Sunni Arabs there in Syria. I don't know it. But I think it is positive that there is different moods of politics and different visions of how to deal with foreign policy questions in the Europe states. We have France with no interrupted military tradition as a strong state, but also Britain. And we have Germany with a completely different history and a completely different climate in politics. And I think this is good for Europe. And I think this should continue. And I think it's also very interesting that the UK is not in a way participating,
but France, on Syria. We're not talking about Iraq, though.
I also think we have to see this in the light of past experiences. I mean, Germany did not participate in the war against Iraq, at least not directly. I mean, they were giving rights to overflow Germany, etc. There was some kind of cooperation and facilitation, but there was no direct intervention. But Germany was present in Afghanistan, and I mean, the withdrawal just happened. So I think, and this was quite controversial in Germany. I mean, this participation in the Allied forces in Afghanistan. And I think that this is also a reason why Germany is quite reluctant. I mean, first of all, Germany doesn't really have the military power.
But it is sending weapons to the Kurds.
Yes, because it is about reinforcing the regional forces, yes, the military forces, but no direct intervention and, if possible, no troops on the ground, although there are now officers going to train Kurdish Peshmerga forces. But yeah, I think it has also to do with the fact that Germany is very afraid, as a country which is right in the middle of Europe and accessible from all sides, is quite afraid because there is a growing number of Islamist radicals, although Germany is not the country with the highest proportion. I mean, there are higher proportions if you compare the number, if you compare the number of Salafists and if extremists and the population, the number of inhabitants. But still, I think Germany is quite afraid also of this, maybe a retaliation or of growing tension within Germany, and probably also is afraid of attacks, of maybe terrorist attacks.
Steph, what do you think? I
mean, what this radical Islam is offering to people, especially young people, is a kind of very simple worldview. We are living in a very complicated world, and we know that the simple answers are very much in favor in the last times. And this is also part of the problem. This makes this development very dangerous. If you know that this is the enemy, and this is good, and this is bad, and someone is... someone is really leading your life, and this attracts people. And this is a very, very strong anti-modern threat we have all over the world. And the question is, and this is an intellectual challenge to the whole Muslim world, how we can develop pictures, how we can develop stories of successful Muslim societies, Muslim people, individuals who are existing with their belief and with modernity together.
With people who are not Muslim. In other words, you're saying diversity.
We had this already. We had this already in the Muslim world, and this position lost ground. And I think this is what I try to explain, that we need a kind of coalition. We don't need a new war, we need a kind of coalition.
That's going to be another show, because we could talk all day about how that would look. We're running out of time. I want to ask all three of you about the role of the United Nations in this. Günter, you mentioned that this is not happening. These airstrikes, this whole campaign against ISIS is not happening with the blessing of the UN Security Council. Has this disaster in Syria, will it be the impetus, the catalyst to reform the UN so that it is representative of our world?
I see we are again in a contradictory, because particularly the Turkish government that in the last years very much criticized the composition, for example, of the Security Council of the United Nations, and I think it has a point in it. We need a representative of a Muslim country or of the Muslim civilization in the in the Security Council. Yeah, with really a say in the decisions. I think this is very important. And at the same time, we have to recognize that...
Let me ask you, which country would it be? I mean, if you were putting the Security Council together now, who would you put? Would you put Saudi Arabia or would you put Iran? I mean, what's the answer there?
I would put Turkey, naturally.
Turkey.
There is no other...
There you go.
Because it's a mediator.
It is the mediator, right?
Mature and it's
but that speaks to Ankara.
But why don't we listen to Turkey for over years? That's the question. Why we don't listen to the guys talking about these issues since years
I don't think that Turkey is that isolated. But coming back to your question, I think the UN has been a complete failure in terms of Syria. When it came to Syria, when this terrorist regime, and we still have to see that this terrorist Assad regime has killed many more people, like 10 times as much or more, than the Islamic State up to now.
Yes, up to now.
So I think up to now, within 3 years. So I think it is a complete failure that the UN institutions were unable to act together and to secure really the survival of the Syrian people. And there is a genocide going on in Syria. There is a collective massacre going on. Half of the people, of the Syrian people, of the inhabitants, half of them are uprooted today. We have at least 4 million refugees. We have 6 million IDPs. So I think this is a complete failure, and we really need reform.
All right. As you can see, there's plenty to talk about, but I want to thank all three of you for coming on the show today. And I want to thank you for watching us here on Quadriga. Don't forget, you can watch the show again at DW's website. Just go to dw.de, and you can follow me on Twitter. If you want to see our tweets from the show, you can follow me at Brent Goff TV. I'm Brent Goff. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.